Hello and welcome to another great episode of I Miss Book Club. My name's Veronica Reynolds. I'm the head of community relations at New City Library. And as ever, I'm joined by my co-host, Dana Munch, one of our adult services librarians. Good morning, Dana.
Hello.
And this week we are discussing Good Eggs by Rebecca Hardiman, which was this month's chapters book.
It was. We just spoke about it, so I'm excited.
So I'm really curious about how you settled on this one because this one's a debut novel. So there's no history to this author. In fact, her bio on every site I could find just says that she's a former magazine editor who lives in New Jersey with her husband and 3 children. That is what's on every review, every author thing.
Yes, I came across this also. Tell us more. Yeah, I feel like I have a weird knack for picking these quirky books. And this one, my group had read the book The Curious Charms of Arthur Pepper by Phaedra Patrick a few years ago, which is sort of this like more lighthearted type of book. And they loved it. So when I remembered that they loved it so much, I went searching for a book that would be similar. Mm-hmm. And somehow through a chain of internet clicks, I stumbled upon Good Eggs. And when I read that it was like a family story, and it takes place in Ireland, which adds a little bit of, pizzazz to reading because it's somewhere different from where we are. It seemed like something that would have a lot to talk about. So that is how I chose it.
I mean, it is really well reviewed. What I thought was interesting, because there wasn't a lot out about her, I went to her author site, which usually I don't like to use as a reference because obviously it's very, it's fine, but it usually doesn't have a ton about the author, actually. It has a lot of other books. And the website's very spare because she only has the one book. And like one of the first things on the site is a book club kit. So it seems like it's one of those books that was marketed specifically to book clubs, which does happen. Mm-hmm. I don't think we've talked about that before, but like there are some books that publishers pick because they think they're going to be like successful book club books, right? So
yeah,
you can always smell these because they come with the questions at the back of the book, right?
Yes.
Where they have one of these things on a website where it's like a branded guide of questions. And I don't think that's aimed at libraries so much as it is like personal book clubs that might be getting started.
Yeah, I would agree. To me, it's like a resource for the kind of average person to host a book club and have some guidance and context for doing so.
I mean, I've used them when I've led book clubs.
I use them too.
But I thought that was very funny that her website, even before it talks about her, says book club kit. So this one was ripe for it. So how did book club go? Did everyone like this one?
So just a little bit of a summary about the book. It is a family story. It centers on the Gogarty family. They live in Ireland. The entire book takes place in Ireland. And while the family has 4 kids, 2 parents, and a grandparent, there is really like 3 main characters, which is the grandmother. Her name is Millie. Her son, or the father of the family, is Kevin. And then his daughter, Aideen, who is actually a twin. And she has 2 other siblings as well, but she is the 3rd main character, I would say. And essentially, Millie is caught shoplifting in a store yet again. So Kevin, who is sort of like at his wit's end with her, decides that she needs someone to look after her at home. And he finds her this home aide. And she, is not all that she appears to be. And at the same time, Aideen, Kevin's a stay-at-home dad. He lost his job recently. His wife is a very like high-powered corporate job, and so she's the primary breadwinner of the family. But he's home with the children, and their daughter Aideen is like very misbehaved and is, troubled, we'll say. Her relationship with her twin is especially bad, so there's like a lot of arguments in the home. And then it just is about like how, Millie's hijinks and the issue with the caretaker and Aideen's journey through her teenage, years, and Kevin's ability or non-ability to deal with these events sort of unfolds throughout the book. But yeah, people liked it. Like I said, I picked it to be light, especially after having read Hamnet last month, I felt like
Yeah.
we needed a
Well,
palate
well,
cleanser.
from child death, we're gonna.
Yeah, so we needed something a little bit lighter. There was a lot because it deals with so many generations in the book, like each main character is sort of a different generation. It was a nice way to kind of bring everyone together at the book group because everyone sort of came from someplace different. And it was interesting to hear people talk about like their family experiences at whatever time they were growing up. And there was just a lot of things to pick at with this one.
So one of the reviews that I read, because I read a couple of reviews, I did find like one interview with her, but it was mostly reviews that were out there. Um, this one, they liked the book. Their contention was that Kevin is the source of all of his own problems and possibly the source of everyone else's problems.
Yeah, I will say that I personally did not find Kevin to be a very likable character. And we've talked about unlikable characters on this podcast before, but he was like very annoying to me. And I kind of agree with this. Like, there's a lot of things that I was very frustrated with him for because I was like, if you just paid attention a little bit more, if you were just slightly less rigid about your own thinking, like if you were a little bit more open minded, some of these things would not have happened. And he makes some of his own bad choices himself, but he is kind of like an annoying character.
Yeah, I was just curious about that because it sounds like the book is divided basically among those three characters from their perspective as well, right? Like it's a tight.
Yes, that's correct.
I should probably gloss back and say a tight third, meaning it's a third person. It's not written I, but a tight third means you're like over the shoulder of the character as opposed to an omniscient third character is like basically writes like the author voice, right? Like from far back.
Yeah, you're very much with them, but it's
Yeah.
from their perspective.
And it's these three characters. And this person was like, I loved Millie. I love Adine as the daughter. And they're like, Kevin is the worst. I hate.
Yeah, I did not love Kevin. But what was interesting is at book group, I sort of mentioned that I wasn't a big Kevin fan. And one of the women was like, well, I feel for him. And I was like, tell me more. And so she was sort of talking about, in her eyes, Kevin was having this like midlife crisis. And she's like, it's hard to lose your job. And then he was sort of thrust into being the primary caretaker of the home, which is not necessarily like a job that he chose for himself. It was a job that he was kind of like arrived at given the other circumstances around him. And he does, to give him some credit, he does do a good job of being a stay-at-home dad. There's no indication that he's like this, stereotypical fumbling dad at home. There isn't really any attention given to the fact that his wife is the primary caretaker and how that is a role reversal, which I really appreciated reading in a book because
Yeah.
it isn't something that you come across very often, and especially don't come across without there being some sort of commentary about how this is different than what's normal. Like in this family and in this book, it's just presented as like this is the way that it is, and there are, Kevin does have some resentment about the fact that she gets to go to these exotic locales and travel around for her business while he's stuck at home, especially with when one of their children is difficult. And she has her own issues with like, she's very tired from having to carry the weight of financial support for the family and he doesn't quite understand where she's coming from. So there is like strife that comes from this dynamic. But in general, it is just presented as a very normal way for a family to function. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I mean, the strife sounds like the same strife there is if the roles were reversed, right? Like,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah, that one person's very tired from working all day and maybe does not pull their weight when they get home, and the other person is tired from pulling the weight at the home. Yeah, I mean, that feels very universal, and it's nice to see that be loosened from gender and not commented on.
But
Relatable.
yeah, she was a little bit more kind towards Kevin and more understanding. But I still think that his internal monologues were, felt annoying to me as well.
Well, like that's interesting, right? Because you've said you don't mind an unlikable narrator, but do you think there's a difference between unlikable and irritating?
Yeah, I do. Well, I guess when I use the word unlikable, it's sort of like they do quote unquote bad things, like things that are maybe immoral or um, just you would see them as wrong or terrible in some way. And I feel like that can be a valid form of like understanding other people.
Yeah.
But some characters are just like irritating because it seems like they lack self-awareness, which is something that is very annoying to me. And or especially in books, sometimes it's like the thing in horror movies, like, oh, if they only had a cell phone, like that kind of
Right.
thing. Like, it's like, oh, if you just did this one thing, or if you could just do this thing that seems very obvious, we wouldn't have this problem, but then you probably wouldn't have the book. So these things are sometimes plot devices, but it can make them seem annoying.
So like that's the thing, right? Like I think when a character becomes a plot device instead of a character, it's irritating. I am a
Mm.
big I really nope out with books that are hinged on communication issues where they're like, if you would just tell somebody one thing one time, and I know the contention is, well, then there wouldn't be a book, but I don't think that's true. I think it would just be a different kind of book.
Yeah.
And look, obviously miscommunication is a really important plot device and hard to get rid of. But I find it especially, obviously, this is more of like a domestic novel, but like in romantic comedy kind of books or romances, like that's a huge trope is like they just can't speak honestly to each other. And I'm like, that's not a good foundation for a relationship that I'm supposed to be rooting for. You want me to root for them? They
Yeah.
have to be able to talk to each other. Are you kidding? Like, I much prefer in those kinds of books an outside adversary. I find the internal adversary where like someone just can't connect with another person to be very difficult personally. But um especially if it doesn't feel in tone with the other things that the character is doing, you know.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's the case here. Like, it does seem like he is a consistent character. But the communication issue is something that we actually about in the group as well, because like we were talking about dysfunctional families and how like all families are a little bit dysfunctional. And then when we talked about why that might be, really it's that like communication skills are difficult. Um, and it's something that you have to be cognizant about and sort of learn how to do. You're not necessarily taught how to do it. And if the people around you aren't great communicators, you probably won't be one either. And so the communication issue is like a big problem in this book because the Kevin seems like so Adine in comparison to her twin is very much like a deep thinker and she's a little angsty and introspective, but because of that reason she's overlooked in favor of her twin who is more boisterous and outgoing. And so there's that dynamic. And like Kevin just seems to be wildly unaware that Adine might be feeling anything. And so like there's this point later in the book where so part of this too is that they like send her to this boarding school, and they don't bring it up to her. She kind of like finds the applications and then blows up at them about it, and they still send her anyway. They're not willing to listen to why she doesn't want to go or what her feelings are about it. And later in the book there's a point where Kevin finds like her journal and sees a couple of things that she's written, and he's like, oh, Adine is sad. Like it's this big revelation in the book. And I was like, she's a teenage girl and you sent her away to boarding school and wouldn't listen to her at all. Like, yeah, she's probably a little sad.
I mean, again, probably very realistic, but like deeply sad to read, like that when you
Yeah.
parent like bad parenting is a tough trope, right? Like that's like you need it. It's real to life. But sometimes when I'm reading it, I'm like, oh my god.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Because Kevin is able to handle the home. Like he's a good parent in the way that he is able to like get the kids where they need to be going and kind of handling all of the home management. But on an emotional level, he seems to be very lost. And which is another thing that kind of came up in our discussions about how like the more time goes on, families seem to be becoming more open with one another. And in previous generations, that maybe wasn't the case and things were not discussed as openly. And you see that a little bit in the book too. Like Millie, there's mention in the book that Millie had like a traumatic experience as a young mother, and say a few times, like, she doesn't talk about this. Like, this is something that was never talked about. Kevin, even though he's her child, like, barely even knows what happened or the context around it. And he was in that family. And so this goes back to the conversation I was saying before about how, like, if you grow up around people that aren't open about things, and you may not be open about them either. And you see that in the way that he interacts with his children,
Mm.
and his children just seem to be sort of lost at sea with, like, does, their mom isn't home and their dad doesn't emotionally understand them, so they're kind of like
Right.
floating.
It's one of those things where it's like it's not neglect in the sense that they're being fed and they get where they need to go and they have clean clothes. It's all of these like the surface level needs are taken care of. It's just Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
It's all like the base stuff's
Pyramid.
taken care of, but like we don't really deal with the rest of it. And that can be so generational. I find it interesting that as an American writer, she said it in Ireland. I wonder what that means.
I found this interesting too. And in the book, she uses a lot of, like, Irish slang,
Hmm.
which was difficult at times. Like, some of it you were able to understand within the context what it means or might mean, but there were definitely parts where I was like, I have no idea what this means, what this is meant to mean. And I sort of wish there had been, like, some kind of glossary or something. One woman in particular in our group was, like, very put off by this. She's like, it's supposed to be funny and light. And she's like, but I found myself very frustrated that I couldn't understand these jokes when they came up, which sort of undermines the humor of it, which I don't necessarily agree with. Like, I think the characters are all very quirky, and, like, the grandmother in particular, her hijinks are very, like, funny to me. But I could definitely see how it is a little bit frustrating because I had a similar experience.
It's interesting because the interviewer, so I found this one interview. I'm sure there's more. I will admit that I did not do the deepest dig in the world, but the interview I found, um, she was asked directly, like, you seem to have this really good grasp on Irish culture and dialect and experience, but they had folded it into another question about stopping
Mhm.
and starting writing, and she just didn't answer the part about the Irish culture.
Oh no, I
I
would
mean,
have
like,
loved to
I don't
hear
think she
it.
was avoiding it. I think she just answered the other part of the question that was
Yeah.
put to her. And obviously, it's an edited interview. So I just maybe she did answer it and it was just taken out. But yeah, I don't think they were following it. So I'm very curious about it because it's an interesting choice. I mean, I don't know if she was born here. She might be Irish, to be fair. Again, the biography is 3 lines long, so who knows? But um, I don't know. I, I don't know what that means. What they were
I had
thinking.
sort of a similar feeling about it because I sometimes like to mention a little bit about the author when we meet, and I couldn't really find anything substantial about her because I was like, is she Irish? Does she have an Irish family? Is this a place that she visits a lot? Like, there's a lot of reasons why someone may choose to write about another country. If she doesn't have any ties to it, I would find that a little bit weird. Just like, it seems a little bit random to take a deep dive. But
Especially with the
um,
amount of slang that you're saying she uses. It's not like it's just like a
yeah,
casual setting. So she must have some tie back. She
yeah.
talks
And
about, yeah, go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say she does sort of do. There's a point where that takes place in Florida, so they're in the U.S. and she does a lot of, like, offhanded comments about, like, things that are different between the states and Ireland that the characters notice, which is sort of like a fun little sprinkle when you're reading it. They, like, remark about the coffee mugs being enormous, and like, some of the candies that you can get here and not there, like things like that, which I thought was fun.
Yeah, that speaks to someone who has some experience, I would imagine, of comparing the places. I suppose it doesn't really matter. I think the reason I always think about it is I think Ireland in particular has become in literature a very romanticized location,
Mm.
and it's always like, well, okay, why are we here? What does it add? What does it do? It's funny because if it was like a fantastical book, I wouldn't even really think about it. It's just when it's a literary fiction title, I'm always curious the setting seems to mean more because it has to be so deliberate because it's so grounded in
Yeah.
reality that you're like dependent on the location pretty strongly.
Yeah, it's just interesting that you bring this up because I'm thinking to myself, like, is there a reason? And I was like, a lot of this is like, there is no real reason why it needs to take place in any particular place. However, there is like one thing, and I don't want to spoil it, but it's like the thing that prompts them to wind up in the US. And so there is like this international component that sort of makes sense within the context of that problem. But I almost feel like it could have been like flip-flopped, like swapped the other way. Not that it really matters, like you said, like I don't really care, but it is interesting. And she bases a lot of it in like Millie, I guess, lives in a more rural area, but there are parts that take place in Dublin. And I have been there, and so it was like sort of fun to hear some of the places like mentioned, like Temple Bar and things like that. But there was no real like tie there. It was just like a family dealing with family stuff, which could happen literally anywhere.
Hmm. That's an interesting little mystery. We'll leave it unsolved, I suppose. But I was thinking about it because we were way back when we were talking about way back when, like 3 months ago, when we were talking about the doors to reading and we were talking about setting.
Mhm.
The book I always think about, and I never remember the title, it was kind of a mystery, I guess, but it was classified as literary fiction. And it took place in Ireland, I think in the 50s. And it was such a strong sense of place. It was one of the first books I read where I was really like, oh, this is about like where you are. Like it really mattered
Mhm.
that it was in this rural Irish neighborhood. I think it was the postman specifically was really important. I haven't read this book in like 15 years, but I remember when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I'm so in this location, very real location. So I guess I kind of tie Ireland into that location part of my reading adventures specifically.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh. So I wanted to read you the sentence from this one review because I thought it was just very on the nose. And you tell me if you think that this sums up what's
Okay.
happening here. Put another way, it's a book about a house with a bad foundation, and it happens everywhere else. And then, oh, look, how much better it is when the foundation is fixed.
I wouldn't necessarily call their foundation bad. Like, to me, it seems like a very normal family. I mean, like, the stuff with Millie is a little bit different, I guess I'll say. Like, she's this shoplifting grandmother. Like, she does a lot of like very quirky things. And I think that was part we talked about, like, why she might be like that too in book club. But I don't see them as anything like extraordinarily different than any other family that has communication issues. And this is a feel good book. Like, it has a happy ending. Things are very resolved at the end, and the characters come to some realization. I don't know, like, how the sense I get is that that realization seems very shallow. And if I were to project forward, I'm not sure that I would think that most things would be fixed. But certainly there's more of an awareness about what's happening and like an idea of how things need to change a little bit. Millie and Adine in particular become very close. And so it was interesting to see these sort of like two people who were kind of like forgotten about or seen as black sheep of their family a little bit kind of connect together and create a bond where there wasn't one previously when they both feel put out by the rest of the family. So that was like kind of sweet. Again, Kevin is just the the worst.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, like, I don't totally disagree with it, but I disagree with it.
Yeah, that's fair. I was curious because that whole review was very concerned or not with whether it was a feel good book, which I feel like is a whole other episode about like what is feel good, right?
Yeah, I can see this too, because as I'm saying it, I even in my mind, I'm like, well, because like there are a lot of things that happen, and there's a lot of strife, and there's like a lot of bad things that happen. But I think it's presented in a way that's sort of like quirky and funny. So I think that's where the lightheartedness comes from. It doesn't feel heavy to read about, even though some of the things are very like could be heavy if presented differently.
A feel good book has to have some weight to it, I think. For me anyway, if I was going to describe something as feel good, it made me feel something. It can't be,
Mhm.
you know, I like a lot of books that are just like airy comedies, but I wouldn't call them feel good books because they're comedies. They're just meant to be funny. A feel
Right.
good book to me, I was actually thinking of the book that we've discussed in an episode that'll be out later. When you were talking about Running with Sherman, that sounded to
Mm.
me like that's a feel good book where it's like a triumph over adversity book to me,
Yeah.
feel good book. When people see the error of their ways and apologize and correct behavior and good things happen because of that, that is like a feel good theme to me. I don't think feel good necessarily means, and everybody was fine the whole time.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I would add to that, like, I'm not even well, I'm not even sure that that applies here. So maybe it's not a feel good book, but because, like I said, things are wrapped up at the end, but some of it feels unsatisfactory to me. Also, the last few sentences of the book are a little bit strange, and we talked about that as well. The ending is a little bit like unsatisfactory, but or at least in my opinion. But that is interesting. Like, I don't know that things are really triumphed over in the way that you would normal, or at least not to the degree that you would think about, like for other quote unquote feel good titles. But like I said, it's more that things are presented lightheartedly
Hmm.
in relation to what they are actually about. Like, because you can certainly look at the things in this book and be like, wow, this is really terrible. And if you dig into it, you're like, you would have to be creative a little bit, right? But you could imagine that underneath these characters' behaviors is like deep emotional wounds. And so,
Yeah.
like, if you wanted to like go that far, especially for Millie, but that's not something that's discussed in the book. It's not brought up. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it's really not a theme that is covered in that way. And so it doesn't make it heavy or sad to read about.
So like, okay, I have a metaphor that'll be a little bizarre, but come with me.
Okay.
I was thinking as you were talking about this and talking about like what's underneath. So like the structure of the Batman story, right? The Batman origin story is he's a young kid whose parents are killed in front of him, and he goes on a
Yes.
huge lifelong vengeance arc and becomes a vigilante, right? Like this is the Batman
Mhm.
story. It's been told 20 million times in film and in TV.
Approximately.
Right. But you have like wildly different interpretations of that, right? So you have like the 1960s show with Eartha Kitt and Adam West, and like that's extremely cartoony and bubbly, and like I think arguably pretty feel good. I'm sure there's episodes that don't hold up to the test of time, but like if you're just watching like Adam West and I forgot the guy who played Robin, like just make horrible jokes and do pow noises, and pow comes up on the screen. Like you're not like, wow, this guy is super motivated by tragedy. But then, like, you watch the Christian Bale, Christopher Nolan movies, and it's like, wow, this is real dark and real gritty, and this guy is real sad. And it's the same story, right? Like, we're not operating from a different standard concept. And I think, like, maybe that's even the definition of literary versus pop fiction, right? It's the same story, but like, what gloss are you putting on it?
Yeah, I love this metaphor. I think it's a really good one. And I do think it applies here. Like I said, like some of these themes would be dark if they were presented in a different way, but they're not, so it's not, is kind of how it feels.
Okay, so let me ask you the big question. Is this literary fiction or is this pop fiction?
I would say maybe it's pop fiction. I don't think that it has quite as much like depth to it as I would expect in a more traditional literary fiction title, if we're going to go with the traditional definitions
Right.
of what that
Question
means.
mark forever on
Uh,
that. Yeah.
but it is, I would say it's more like pop fiction. Um, yeah.
Is it a beach read?
Is it a beach read? I don't say immediately yes. Like it could be. It's a lighter fare. It could definitely be a vacation read for sure. Um, but I wouldn't necessarily think beach.
It only comes to mind because we just did that webinar on so at New City Library, you can find them on YouTube. There's a series of webinars we do called What We're Reading and What's New. And our head of adult services, Brian Jennings, speaks with different librarians about their collections and at different points in the year about like what's coming out, what we've read that we've liked. And I was asked to join in for the summer reading one because I run the adult summer reading program. And I had posed a question to Nancy and to Brian: what is a summer read? Because we say it like, what's a beach read, right? And it is a question I've gotten from patrons, and I'm sure you have too. Like, hey, I'm going away on vacation. Like, what's a light, fun book that I can read? And I'm always like,
Yep.
and I'm pulling books that are like 20 years old out of my back pocket because I'm like, I don't know what you like. What do you count as a summer read? Like, it's a kind of an amorphous concept, you know, but I do think mostly what people want is to not feel like weighted down, either
Yeah.
because it's long or because it's heavy.
I would agree with that. I think it's something that like I have such a weird metaphor like forming in my head about like how much like tooth feel you want in your book.
Ooh,
so
feel I
so
like
like
that though.
so
Yeah.
it's like if you just want something that's like easy, and I'll use the word fun loosely because something like this isn't necessarily, I mean, this one maybe is fun, but some of these things could not be like fun, but they're light,
Mhm.
versus like things having a lighter tone, but still having enough meat in it. So it's like a little crispy still is my flavor of thing that I like to read on a vacation. So there is like a spectrum here of
Yeah.
what people are really looking for.
How much like
But I would say this is a summer read.
because I just, I was thinking I know we're straying from the plot here, but I always recommend Bridget Jones's Diary to people who haven't read it as a summer read, because that to me is like, because it's written in those short little diary entries.
Uh-huh.
Like pick it up and put it down really easily. That's what I mean. I was like it's a 20-year-old book. Like I don't think I'd recommend it anymore, only because I think it's aged out of relevance in some ways. And it's a Pride and Prejudice, retelling really. I just I don't know. Like I am so demented with this because for me, summer reading books, I read YA in the summer. Um,
Yeah, I do too sometimes.
but that can be very heavy. It's not like it's light. It's just faster to read because the reading level is a little bit simplified. Not every YA book, but I mean the vocabulary has been simplified usually. So they read faster, but they're just as heavy, if not heavier. I mean, YA books wrestle with some big stuff.
Yeah, some of them are very uh involved. I remember picking one up because someone had said offhandedly to me, "Oh, like, oh, I loved that book," and I just was in the mood for YA, so I was like, "Let me read this," and I was like, "Oh my god!" Like,
There's one, I think it's called Dante and Aristotle Discover the Universe or Explore the Universe. I recommend it to people all the time. It's a great book, but like the plot was really quite heavy, and it takes place like over the course of a summer, if memory serves. It definitely, some
Mhm.
of it's in the summer because they're definitely swimming in one scene, so it feels like a summer read. But like you're not going to be like, wow, this is so easy to pick up and put down. I was like crying over this book.
Well, and interestingly, I think it was on our summer reading bookshelves
Yes,
in our
it
old
was.
location.
So like that bookshelf, like I know we've gone so far afield, but it seems like we've exhausted the book. Tell me if we haven't. But
I think we have.
okay, so in our library, before we were undergoing renovation, we had this teen summer reading books, which were separated out because it was a high demand collection for many years. And then I think about 5 or 6 years ago, the school district decided that rather than having a list of approved books, you could read whatever you wanted, right? So they had the list still, those lists are just suggested. And obviously that meant that those books were in far less demand than they used to be. Like there was a day where you could walk into the library and there was like 5 sad copies of something left on the shelf because it had been so picked over. But we kept it, and I think we kept it because of summer reading globally rather than like locally, because it just has become this collection. It's really easy to pick things off when someone comes in and says, oh, I'm not sure what to get my son or daughter. um, you know I just want to get them something actiony, and you're like, oh great, because it's like there's always a couple copies and it's a good pull. And I started pointing adults there because a lot of the books were written for adults anyway.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think if you are not sure what to read next in your life, check out your local school district summer reading list because there's some real bangers on this list.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Like, it was a great place to go for readers advisory purposes, especially because like those books are summer reading because they have something about them that makes them interesting, or like popular for in some cases. So, and like you said, there was always multiple copies. It was like a good way to kind of like, it was easily browsable, and you can like kind of just pick and choose in a way that's less overwhelming than approaching the entire library.
And enduring, right? Those are all books that had survived being on this list, sometimes for like decades. Like our team
Yeah.
often lament this, that some of the books that were on that list were no longer in print and she couldn't get them anymore. But I think for the most part, like there's books on there that I find like they were super popular when they came out and they've managed to like lodge into consciousness. Like obviously there's your Twilights, there's your Hunger Games, there's your Harry Potters for whatever that's worth that will linger forever. But there's like these kind of secondary books that aren't classics yet. They're not old enough to be classics, but they've lingered on that shelf. Like one that comes to mind is Uglies by Scott Westerfeld.
Yeah.
And he's quite popular, but he was never like Hunger Games popular. But that one's lingered around. Like and I read that series, that's a great YA series if anyone's looking for it. Climate Change Disaster by Orchids. Super strain of orchids. But I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon, the summer read, the teen summer read. I don't know. And it's that line blur too, I guess, between YA. I don't know that I have a point where I'm going. It's just on my mind.
Basically, we love the summer reading bookshelves and look forward to them being reinstated.
I hope they come back with us into the new building. I know right now we're poring over shelving very intently. So that's a whole episode. If anyone ever cares, leave us a comment on iTunes if you want to know more about what renovating a library is like. Because boy, howdy, are we going through it? It's fun. I mean, I don't mean that negatively, but what a complicated process it is. There's so many things.
Yeah, I'm sure it will all be worth it, and we're looking forward to seeing what that is like. But in the meantime, the figuring out of all the bits and pieces of trying to offer as much stuff as we can in a different place is challenging, but we're doing it.
So we've got this podcast going, which I don't think we would have done if we weren't renovating. So
that is true.
And for me, that's a net positive. I hope it is for you too, Dina.
It certainly is.
I think that's a good note to go out on this week. Did you have any last thoughts? I know that we have gone beyond the point, but
no, I would say if you're a person that likes books like Where'd You Go, Bernadette, or The Curious Charms of Arthur Pepper, or Evie Drinks Her Sober, or one of those types of books, you probably would like this one too. Or if you're just looking for something a little bit lighter and want to read about a family that is possibly more dysfunctional than your own, then this might be a good read for you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dana. I appreciate it. Love talking to you about this stuff. Even if we wandered away from the book, my apologies. I got distracted. But I hope everyone had a great time with us. We look forward to talking with you again soon, and read on.